Margaret Fenwick stood in the receiving hall of Wrendale, with her own wedding ring already loosened in her palm. And she did not scream. She did not weep. She did not reach for the doorframe, though the room had gone strange and tilted, the way a ship tilts before anyone below decks understands the water has changed. She set the ring down on the long oak table, between a bowl of late roses and a stack of unopened correspondence, and she did it with both hands, slow, so that no one watching could say her hands had shaken. 8 months gone with his child, and her husband stood 20 feet away with a letter in his fist that was not in her hand, and he was telling 40 people who had come to dine that the child she carried was not his to claim. By morning she would be gone from Wrendale Hall, though no one in that room yet knew it, not even her. He did not know, this man now holding a forged sheet of paper like it was scripture, that he would spend 8 years learning the exact price of what he had just called worthless. He did not know that the ring cooling on the table beneath the roses would return to his hand a different object entirely, carrying a different verdict, spoken by a different mouth. He knew only what the letter told him, and what his mother had taught him to fear since he was a boy of 9 standing at his father's grave. He believed it. That was the worst of it, and the truest. The county of Wexmoor had come to Wrendale that autumn the way it always did in the last golden week before the harvest, heavy with apples and gossip in equal measure, indifferent to any single household's ruin. 9 months earlier, Margaret Fenwick had married Julian Ashcombe, 6th Duke of Wrendale, in a ceremony attended by everyone who mattered, and noticed by almost no one who did the actual work of the estate. She had been the daughter of a land agent, not a peer, and the match had scandalised precisely the people it was designed to scandalise, which was, in the small mathematics of county pride, the entire point of a duke marrying beneath himself for love rather than money. It had not looked, from outside, like love. That was the thing nobody had troubled to learn. Julian Ashcombe did not know how to be loved. Not really. Not since his father died with a doctrine on his lips instead of a blessing, that the line must be unimpeachable, that a Wrendale bride must be provable in blood and provable in conduct, because his own mother, the boy Julian had once adored, had left the old Duke for a Frenchman when Julian was 9 and never once written to explain why. The old Duke had raised his son on that absence like a catechism. Julian had grown into a man who mistook vigilance for love, and could not tell the two apart even when he tried, and in the first year of his marriage he had tried, in his clumsy, ledger-minded way, reading over her shoulder when she worked the estate accounts, correcting nothing, only watching, the particular stillness of a man cataloguing evidence he did not yet know he was gathering. Margaret had not minded the watching. She had minded, later, that it had a purpose she had not been told. She ran Wrendale's household accounts within 4 months of her marriage better than the steward who had held the post for 11 years, and nobody thanked her for it, because nobody was meant to notice a duchess doing sums at all. She corrected a grain tally that would have shorted 40 tenant families through a hard winter. She wrote, in her own hand, the letters that secured better terms with the wool merchants at Netherfield Fair, and signed them with Julian's name because that was how such letters were signed, and never once asked for the credit, because credit had never been the thing she wanted. She wanted to be seen. It is a smaller thing to ask for than people believe, and a harder one to receive. Her father, dead 3 years before her marriage, had left her one estate, a neglected, mortgaged, unfashionable property called Thornfield Grange, 40 miles south, with sheep that had not been properly sheared in a decade, and a roof that let in more weather than it kept out. He had also left her a habit she carried like a second inheritance: keep the ledger. Every transaction, every promise, every debt owed and owed to you, write it down, date it, and never destroy a page even when the truth in it stops being convenient. Not because paper is honest, he had told her once, over a kitchen table with ink on his fingers, but because people are not, and paper remembers what people conveniently forget. She was carrying that habit, and his child, on the September evening Reginald Ashcombe arrived at Rendale with a letter, he said, had come from a woman in Bristol, who claimed to have kept company with the Duchess before her marriage, a soldier's widow, the letter said, paid handsomely for a silence she was now. Out of Christian conscience, breaking, it named a man. It named a date. It was. Margaret would learn 8 years later in a room full of witnesses, written entirely in Reginald's own hand, and copied twice to disguise the copying. Because Reginald Ashcombe stood one unimpeachable heir away from a dukedom that would otherwise never be his, and a duchess with a child in her belly was the single obstacle between him and a thing he had wanted since he was old enough to. Count the distance in the family tree. Julian read the letter twice before dinner. He said nothing to her. That was his particular failure, the one she would name for him plainly, years later, across a table with the terms of his forgiveness laid out like a contract. Not that he believed the lie, but that he let it sit in him for 6 hours, watching her pour tea and speak to guests and carry his child, without once asking her the question a husband owes a wife before he owes anyone else an answer. He asked his mother instead, his mother, who had spent 9 years teaching him that women who left rooms without explanation could not be trusted, and who saw in the letter not a doubt to be tested, but a solution she had wanted from the day he brought Margaret home, told him what to believe before he had finished asking. By the time the dining room emptied into the receiving hall for coffee, Julian Ashcombe had already decided, though he would spend 8 years insisting to himself that he had only ever wondered. He stood before his assembled guests, the vicar, 2 magistrates, the wool merchant Abel Kirby, who had liked her from the first, Lady Henshaw, who had not, and he read the letter aloud. Not all of it. Enough. The room went the particular kind of quiet that has weight to it, the way a held breath has weight. "I am told," Julian said, and his voice did not shake either, which she would later understand was its own kind of tell, "that the child my wife carries may not be got of me." Nobody moved. Margaret set down her cup with terrible gentleness, both hands, so it would not rattle in its saucer, and she looked at him the way she had once looked at a column of figures that did not sum, not with panic, but with the settled attention of someone about to find the error. "Say the rest of it," she said. "Say it plainly. You have read half a letter to a room. Finish the sentence or sit down." He did not finish it. He could not, because the letter did not actually accuse her of anything a magistrate could act on. It accused her of a season's acquaintance 11 months before their wedding, phrased with the particular vagueness of something written to wound rather than to prove. But a half-finished accusation, spoken by a duke before 40 witnesses, does not need to be provable. It only needs to be said. "I will not raise a child under a shadow I cannot answer for," Julian said, and that sentence, more than any other he spoke that night, was the one she carried away whole, unaltered, word for word, for 8 years. Not the accusation, the cowardice dressed as principle. Margaret Fenwick did not weep, and did not scream, and did not defend herself to a room that had already decided the shape of the story it wanted to tell at breakfast. She took off her ring instead, worked it over a knuckle gone slightly swollen with the child, and set it on the table between the roses and the letters, and she said, in a voice pitched for the whole room and steady all the way through, the only sentence she would allow herself that night, "You will regret reading half of that letter more than you have ever regretted anything in your life, and I will not be here to watch it happen." Then she went upstairs, packed one trunk with her own hands, refusing the maid who came weeping to help her, and gave herself exactly 20 minutes at the window, with her forehead against the cold glass. She counted them on the mantel clock, because counting was the only thing that kept the ration from becoming a flood, and at the end of the 20 minutes she blew out the candle, and did not cry again that year. By dawn she was on the Thornfield Road with her father's ledger in her lap and his voice in her head. Write it down. Date it. Keep the page even when it stops being convenient. She was 3 months into her exile before the county learned the child had come and lived, a son, and that the Duchess of Rendale had not, whatever the gossip preferred to believe, fled to a lover in Bristol, but to 40 acres of bad drainage and worse sheep that had belonged to a dead land agent nobody in society had ever bothered to learn the name of. Thornfield Grange received her the way a house receives someone it has been waiting for without knowing it, badly at first, with a roof that dripped into the front hall, and a bailiff's letter already on the kitchen table, threatening the mortgage her father had never paid down. Mrs. Holloway, who had kept the house for her father, and stayed on unpaid rather than leave it standing empty, met her at the gate with a lantern and no questions, which was its own kind of mercy. "You'll want the east room, Mrs., Holloway said. "It don't leak so bad. And you'll want food before you want conversation, I expect." "I want the ledgers," Margaret said. "All of them. Whatever's left." Mrs. Holloway looked at her for a long moment, at the travelling cloak too fine for the mud it had crossed, at the belly under it, at the face that was not crying, and had, by the look of it, no present intention of starting. "There's a lamp in the study still," she said. "It's a poor sort of welcome, I know. It's the only sort I want," Margaret said, and went in. She had, by the mantel clock's honest count, exactly 1 night of grief permitted to her before the work began, and she took it in full, sitting on the floor of a cold study with her father's ledgers spread around her like a court she had convened to judge her own life, and at first light she rose, washed her face in water so cold it stung, and opened the first book. There were, she found by noon, 40 tenant families on Thornfield land, a mortgage overdue by 11 months, a flock reduced by disease and neglect to 60 head from what had once been 300, and a bailiff due to call within the fortnight with the particular patience of a man who has done this before and expects to do it again soon. There was also, she found by the second day, a small, clean fact her father had recorded in his own hand 3 years before he died. A trust, established quietly, naming her sole beneficiary, secured against a debt owed to him by a man whose name she did not yet recognise, but would, in time, come to know very well indeed. She did not understand its significance that week. She only copied it into a fresh ledger of her own, dated the entry, and set it aside the way her father had taught her to set aside every fact whose use was not yet clear. She had a son that winter in a bedroom, with frost on the inside of the window, delivered by a village midwife, and attended by no physician of rank, and she named him Henry after her father, and wrote the date in the ledger beside the entry for the trust, because that was, by then, simply how she recorded things that mattered. She gave herself no ration of grief for that. There had not been time, and there had not, she found, been the need. The child did not feel like loss. He felt, when she held him against the cold, like the first entry in an account that was, for once, entirely her own. By spring the bailiff came, and found a woman at the gate with a stack of figures instead of an excuse, and left an hour later without his writ. "You'll want to know how, Mrs.," Holloway said afterward, half admiring, half alarmed, the way people are alarmed by competence they did not expect and cannot immediately explain. "I offered him something better than his fee," Margaret said. "I offered him a debt paid in full, on a schedule he could verify. Men who collect debts for a living respect a schedule, more than they respect a story." It was the first sentence anyone at Thornfield heard her say that sounded like a plan rather than a wound, and it was, though none of them knew it yet, the first line of the account that would take her 8 years to close. The drainage failed first, as it always does on land left too long, without an owner who cares whether the low fields flood. Margaret walked the boundary of Thornfield in April, with her son on Mrs. Holloway's hip, and a surveyor's chain borrowed from a neighbour she had not yet met. And she found what any competent land agent's daughter would find. A culvert collapsed under the lower meadow, silting the whole southern third of the estate into standing water, that drowned 2 crops a year, and had, by the tenant's own account, drowned them for as long as anyone could remember caring to complain. "Old Grange land's cursed that way," said Sam Coulter, who farmed the largest of the tenant holdings and had the particular flat patience of a man who had watched 3 landlords fail to fix the same problem. "Been so since my father's time. Nothing to be done for it short of digging the whole meadow out, and no money in the estate to pay for the digging." "There's no money to pay a crew," Margaret agreed. "There's 40 families losing 1/3 of their yield to standing water every year, which is a larger sum than the digging would cost, only nobody has ever written it down long enough to see it plainly." She showed him the sum. She had spent 3 nights on it, walking the old drainage plans she'd found, folded into her father's papers against the flood, records the tenants themselves kept in their heads and never on paper. Translating memory into numbers the way she translated everything, patiently, with dates, with names, until the shape of the loss stood undeniable on the page. £211 a year, she told him, lost to 6 weeks of standing water each spring, against a repair she costed, conservatively, at £74 and 11 days of labour if every able tenant gave 4 days apiece, in lieu of a portion of that year's rent. "You'd have us dig our own drain to save our own rent," Sam Coulter said, not quite believing it, the way men do not believe an offer that costs them nothing but effort. "I'd have you dig your own future," Margaret said. "I can't pay you money I don't have. I can pay you land that finally drains." He dug. They all dug. In the end, once Sam Coulter, the first stubborn convert, and stubborn converts make the loudest witnesses, put his own spade in the ground on the first morning, and did not stop until the culvert ran clear. It took 11 days, not the 9 she'd hoped, and it worked, and by June the southern meadow that had drowned every spring anyone could remember stood green and dry and disbelieving of itself, and word of the new mistress of Thornfield. Nobody called her Duchess. Not yet, not in a voice loud enough to carry, though everyone knew the shape of the story attached to her name, began to travel the county roads the way water moves downhill, finding every low place first. It reached Wrendale Hall, 40 miles north, in the particular diminished form gossip always takes by the time it crosses a county, that the cast-off wife had not, as predicted, come to ruin, but had instead fixed a drainage problem 3 landlords had failed to solve in 20 years. Julian Ashcombe heard it from his own steward, delivered sideways, the way servants deliver news they suspect their master does not want, but cannot be forbidden to mention. He said nothing in reply. He asked no questions. But that night, alone in the study where he had once watched his wife work sums over his shoulder without once telling her why he watched, he took down the account book she had kept during their marriage. He had never returned it to her, had in fact never once opened it in the 2 years since she left, and read every entry in her hand from the first page to the last, and found, to his considerable and unwelcome surprise, that he could not locate a single error in 18 months of figures. Not one. He sat with that fact a long time. It was the first almost doubt he allowed himself, small as a struck match in a large dark room, and he told no one about it, and it did not go out. The second competence trial found her that Autumn, when Abel Kirby, the wool merchant who had liked her from the first and never once believed the letter Julian read aloud, sent word that he was travelling south on other business, and would, if it pleased the mistress of Thornfield, call on her about her fleece. It did not please her particularly. She distrusted anyone who had witnessed the worst night of her life, and wanted now to discuss commerce as though nothing had happened. But she received him in the study with the ledgers open on the desk, because that was where she received everyone now, and let the numbers speak before she did. 60 head to 300 in 2 years, Kirby said, turning over a sample of the new season's fleece between 2 fingers with the frank appraisal of a man who had handled 10,000 such samples and trusted his hands over anyone's assurances, and better wool for it. Whoever's shepherding for you knows the business. I am shepherding for me, Margaret said. I read 3 books on it the winter my son was born, and I asked every farmer within 8 miles what his father did wrong, and I wrote down every answer, and I did the opposite of whichever answer 3 men agreed on. Kirby laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh, the kind a man gives when a joke lands better than he expected, and offered her a contract at a rate 11 shillings better per stone than he'd offered any estate in Wexmoor that season. Not out of charity, he told her plainly, but because he did not intend to lose good wool to a merchant less scrupulous about paying fairly the second his competitors noticed what she'd built. You could have told him, Mrs., Holloway said afterward, meaning you could have told him what really happened that night, could have used him to carry the truth back north where it might do some good. Not yet, Margaret said. A truth told before it's proven is only another story. I want mine proven first. She wrote the contract terms into her ledger that night, dated, exact, and beside it, because she had begun, without quite deciding to, keeping a second column in her private accounts that tracked not shillings but reputation, who in the county had begun to speak of her differently, and on what evidence, she wrote a single line, Kirby, converted, watched the wool, not the rumour. It was, though she did not yet know it, the first entry in a witness list that would one day fill a courtroom. Reginald Ashcombe, meanwhile, had not been idle in the 2 years since his letter did its work. A dukedom with an heir in exile 40 miles south was, to a man who had spent his whole life counting the distance between himself and a title, an unfinished piece of business. And he set about finishing it with the patience of someone who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He was, the county agreed, wonderfully easy company, warmest in a room precisely when he had the most to hide, smooth as poured cream, the sort of man who remembered a widow's late husband's name and a farmer's bad knee, and used both, unfailingly, to soften whatever request he was about to make. He began, quietly, buying up small debts against Thornfield's mortgage from men who did not know or care who held the paper, consolidating leverage the way a careful man consolidates anything he intends to use later. He began, too, cultivating the dowager, Julian's mother's replacement in affection if not in blood, Lady Constance, the old Duke's sister, who had raised Julian after his mother's departure and taught him, with the very best of intentions and the very worst of results, that a woman who left without explanation could not be trusted to have had a good one. The boy, Reginald said to Lady Constance one evening, delicately, over a hand of cards neither of them was truly attending to, will be 7 soon. One wonders whether a claim so long unexamined ought to be examined at last, for the dukedom's own protection, of course. Not for my sake. Of course not for your sake, Lady Constance said, and believed him, because believing him cost her nothing, and doubting him would have cost her the comfort of thinking well of someone in a house that had grown, since Margaret left it, very quiet indeed. Julian, when the suggestion reached him, carried sideways again, always sideways, because no one in that house had learned yet to say a hard thing to his face, did not act on it. But he did not dismiss it either, and that hesitation, small as it was the crack Reginald had been patiently widening for 2 years, and he set about widening it further, because a man who hesitates over his own son's legitimacy is a man who can, with enough careful pressure, eventually be made to formalize the doubt in writing. It was into that widening crack that Julian's own history finally spoke, though not the way Reginald intended. Late one night, unable to sleep, Julian found himself once more in the study with his wife's old account book, and beside it, this time, his father's papers, the ones he had never fully read, having been told their contents as a boy, and never questioning the telling. He found, among them, a letter from his mother, the one who had left when he was 9, dated 2 years after her departure, addressed to his father, and never delivered. Discovered only because the old Duke had kept it, unopened, in a drawer he never cleared. Julian opened it that night with hands that were not, he would admit to no one, entirely steady. It was not an excuse. It did not need to be, to do its work. It was an explanation of a marriage arranged before either party had chosen it, of a husband who mistook silence for strength and taught his son the same mistake, of a woman who had tried for 9 years to be loved rather than managed, and left only when she understood the two would never be offered as the same thing. I did not leave our son, she had written. I left a house that had already decided what I was for. I have regretted every day since that I did not find a way to take him with me, or to explain to him before I went that his father's coldness was never proof of my guilt. It was only ever proof of his fear. Julian sat with that letter until the candle guttered, and understood, for the first time in 8 years, that he had built his entire marriage on the same unexamined doctrine his father had built on before him, that silence proves guilt, that a woman's departure is itself the evidence, that love unexplained is love unworthy of trust. He had not asked his wife a single question before he condemned her. He had asked his mother instead, and let her old wound answer for his new one. He did not go south that week. Cowardice, even newly recognised, does not dissolve in a single night, but he began, from that point on, to notice, the way a man notices water rising in a cellar he has avoided visiting, every report that reached him from Thornfield, and to weigh each one, quietly, against the woman he had actually watched keep faultless books for 18 months, and never once caught in an error. The county, meanwhile, had begun its own slow recalibration, the way a tide turns, not all at once, but grain by grain, a word here, a withheld sneer there, until the whole shape of the shore has changed, and no one can name the exact moment it happened. Lady Henshaw, who had disliked Margaret from the wedding on, found herself at a dinner unable to produce a single fresh unkindness when the topic arose, because every fact anyone offered in evidence against the cast-off Duchess had, over 2 years, been quietly overtaken by facts in her favour. The drainage, the wool, the mortgage, paid down 11 shillings at a time. The tenant families who spoke of her, when asked, not with pity but with the particular respect people reserve for someone who fixed a thing they had stopped believing could be fixed. She has done rather well for a woman with nothing, Lady Henshaw allowed, grudgingly, into her wine. She has done rather well for anyone, said Abel Kirby, who happened to be at the same table, and did not trouble to lower his voice. It was the midpoint of the account, though none of them yet knew to call it that. In the ledger Margaret kept at Thornfield, in the second column where she recorded not shillings, but the slow arithmetic of a reputation being rebuilt 1 witness at a time, the entries had begun, for the first time in 2 years, to outnumber the debts. Henry was 4, and Thornfield was, by any honest accounting, thriving, when the first true crack in Reginald's design opened. And it opened not because Julian finally found his courage, but because Reginald, in his patience, made the single error every careful liar eventually makes. He grew confident enough to write something down. He wrote to a solicitor in Bristol, the same city his forged letter had named 4 years before, instructing him, in terms too plain for a careful man to have used had he still believed himself unwatched, to locate any woman answering the description in the original letter and pay her, discreetly, to swear to its contents should the matter ever come before a court. There was, of course, no such woman. There never had been. But there was now a written instruction to invent one, and a solicitor's clerk who did not much like being asked to manufacture false testimony, and who mentioned it carefully to a colleague who happened, by the particular small mercy of a county not so large as it liked to believe, to correspond occasionally with Mr. Prescott, the solicitor who had once handled Margaret's father's affairs, and still, out of old loyalty, handled hers. Prescott brought the intelligence to Thornfield himself on a wet afternoon in Henry's 5th year, and set it on the desk between them with the particular gravity of a man who understands he is handing over a weapon. It isn't proof of anything. Not on its own, he said. A man can instruct a solicitor to find a witness without confessing the witness is invented. But it is, I think, the loose thread you have been waiting for. Margaret read the letter twice, the way she had once told Julian to finish reading his, and felt something in her chest settle rather than break, the particular calm of a woman who has been proven right about a thing she was never permitted to say aloud. "Copy it," she said. "Date the copy. And find me the original of the letter Reginald showed my husband 5 years ago. If he wrote this one himself, he almost certainly kept a fair copy of the first. Men who forge documents for a living rarely trust themselves to remember exactly what they invented, and Reginald has never in his life trusted anyone with a secret he could keep entirely in his own hand. It took the better part of a year, not because the trail was hard to follow, once begun, but because each piece had to be obtained honestly, through a full exchange rather than a shortcut, and Margaret had built her whole life since Thornfield on the discipline of doing nothing that could later be called into question. She wrote to the Bristol solicitor's clerk directly, over Prescott's mild objection, and offered him nothing but the truth of what she needed and why, and found, as she so often did, that decent people given a plain accounting will generally choose to help build it rather than hide from it. She wrote to the midwife who had assisted at Henry's birth, securing a sworn record of the date, precise to the day. That made a nonsense of the Bristol letter's timeline once set beside it. She wrote, finally, to Sam Coulter and Abel Kirby and half a dozen tenants and merchants who had watched her build Thornfield from 60 starved sheep into a working estate, and asked each one plainly whether they would be willing to say, before whoever needed to hear it, what they had seen with their own eyes. Not one of them refused. It was Reginald's counterpunch that nearly cost her the whole careful structure. Word reached him, through the same porous channels that carried every piece of county gossip eventually to everyone who wanted it, that inquiries were being made in Bristol about a letter 5 years old, and he moved with the speed of a man who understood exactly what discovery would cost him. He rode to Rendale Hall himself, and put before Julian a fresh document, sworn before a magistrate of his own choosing, in which a tenant of Thornfield, bribed, though Julian would not learn that for months, attested that the boy Henry had been born a full month earlier than the parish register claimed, timed, conveniently, to place his conception before the wedding and outside any window Julian could credit as his own. "I bring it to you only because I love this family," Reginald said, and meant, Margaret would say later with the particular flatness of a woman reading an old bill of sale, "because I have run out of quieter ways to stop you." Julian did not, this time, read half the document aloud to a room. He rode south instead, alone, without sending word ahead, arriving at Thornfield's gate in the last light of a July evening 7 years and 4 months after he had last seen his wife's face, to ask her, finally, 5 years too late by any fair accounting, but not too late by hers, as it would turn out, the question he ought to have asked before he ever unfolded Reginald's letter in his own hall. She met him at the gate herself. Because Mrs. Holloway was occupied, and because some instinct told her, before she saw his face clearly in the fading light, exactly who had come. Henry was asleep in the house behind her, 7 years old, with her father's dark hair, and, though Julian would not see this for himself for another few minutes, his own mother's particular way of tilting his chin when he was thinking hard about something. "You've grown a beard," Margaret said, because it was true, and because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of an opening line that carried any weight at all. "I've grown a good many things in 7 years," Julian said. "Doubt, chiefly. Doubt is not an apology," she said. "Say what you came to say, or turn around and ride back the way you came. I've a boy asleep who does not know his father's face, and I won't have him woken for half a conversation." He was quiet for a moment, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes. "There's a document," he said. "A tenant, sworn testimony, claiming Henry was born. I know exactly what it claims," Margaret said. "I have the midwife's record dated the same week it happened, sworn before the same magistrate who witnessed your cousin's paper, and I have had it for 3 months, because I do not wait for a fire to buy water. What I want to know is why you rode 40 miles to tell me about a lie instead of asking me, plainly, whether it was one." "I am asking now," Julian said. 5 years and 8 months too late to be the first time you asked," she said. "But not, I think, too late to matter." She looked at him a long moment, the ring finger of her left hand bare, and had been bare for years, and something in her chest, not forgiveness, nothing so soft or so quick as that, but a kind of grim permission to let the account move forward rather than stand closed. Settled into place. "Show me," she said. "Not tonight, and not with words." You are good with words, I remember that much about you. Show me over time, the way I have shown this county for 7 years, one proven thing after another, and we will see what is left to discuss when you are done. And if I am not able to prove it fast enough for you, then you will have proven the only thing that ever actually mattered, Margaret said, which is that you are still the same man who reads half a letter and calls it a verdict. He did not answer that, because there was no honest answer that would not have confirmed it, and instead he reached into his coat and drew out, wrapped in a handkerchief gone soft with years of carrying, the ring she had set down on the table in front of 40 witnesses, 7 years and 8 months before. He had kept it. He did not explain why, because he did not, that night, fully understand it himself, only that he had never been able to give the order to melt it down or sell it or put it away in a drawer he would not open, the way he had done with every other object his mother's departure had ever touched. I don't want it back tonight, Margaret said when he held it out. Give it to Henry. Let it sit in a boy's pocket until his father has earned the right to put it anywhere at all. That's the only safekeeping I trust it to just now. Julian did not go into the house that night. He rode back toward the inn at the crossroads, to wait for whatever came next, and Margaret stood at the gate a long while after he had gone, turning the shape of the evening over the way she turned over a column of figures that had, for the first time in years, actually summed. The document did its damage regardless of the truth behind it. The way a struck match does damage whether or not the room it lands in was dry. Reginald had made certain copies of his sworn statement, reached 3 magistrates, and the vicar of Wexmoor's largest parish, before Julian ever reached Thornfield's gate, seeding doubt in exactly the soil most likely to grow it into scandal by harvest. It was, Margaret understood, within a week of Julian's visit, no longer a private matter she could resolve with a single letter to a single solicitor. It would have to be answered the way Reginald had chosen to attack, in public, before the same body of witnesses whose good opinion he had spent 7 years trying to poison. The county assembly at Wexmoor Hall met twice yearly to settle exactly these kinds of disputes, land claims, contested wills, questions of parish record too tangled for a single magistrate to resolve alone, and Prescott, when Margaret laid the matter before him in full, agreed without hesitation that it was the only forum with the standing to settle the question, once and for all, publicly, in a manner no future forged letter could reopen. You understand, he said, that once it is brought before the assembly, it cannot be quietly withdrawn. Whatever is proven there will be the county's understanding of the matter forever after. That is exactly why I want it there, Margaret said. I have spent 7 years building a life no one can quietly dismiss over a rumour. I do not intend to let my son's name be settled any other way. She spent the following month assembling what she needed with the same patience she had once applied to a collapsed culvert, piece by piece, each one obtained through its own full conversation, rather than a shortcut. The midwife came in person, though it cost her 3 days' travel, because, she told Margaret plainly, she had delivered 11 children in that county, and would not have her word on any one of them called into doubt, by a man who had never once attended a birth in his life. Abel Kirby came, and Sam Coulter, and 4 tenant families whose lives Thornfield's fair wages and honest drainage had changed enough that they were willing to say so before anyone who asked. Prescott obtained, at last through the same Bristol clerk who had first raised the alarm, a signed statement confirming that no woman answering the original letter's description had ever existed, and that Reginald Ashcombe had, 18 months prior, instructed the invention of one in writing. The assembly met on a bright morning in October, in the long hall at Wexmoor that had over the centuries settled disputes far smaller than this one, and a handful nearly as large. It was full before the appointed hour, the county's memory being long, and its appetite for a reckoning longer still, and Margaret Fenwick walked in at the side of Mr. Prescott, with a leather folio under one arm and her son's hand in the other, because she had decided in the end that Henry should stand in the room where his own legitimacy was to be settled rather than wait somewhere to be told the outcome second-hand. Julian was already seated when she entered, and Reginald 2 rows behind him composed. Pleasant, nodding to acquaintances with the particular warmth of a man who has never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted, and did not intend to start now. Mistress Fenwick, the presiding magistrate said, not Duchess, not yet, the county's tongues being cautious things even in a room built for reckonings. You have asked to address a claim brought against your son's legitimacy. You may proceed. She did not raise her voice. That was, later, the detail the county would repeat most often when the story of that morning was retold, that the woman at the centre of the largest scandal Wexmoor had produced in a generation spoke throughout in the same level tone she might have used to read out a column of rents, and that the level tone did more damage to Reginald Ashcombe than any amount of shouting could have managed. I am accused, by a sworn statement obtained from a tenant of my own land, of having borne my son a month before the date the parish register records, she said. I have here the sworn record of the midwife who attended his birth, dated the same week, and a statement from the same tenant recanting his testimony now that he is no longer being paid to give it. A small, audible motion went through the room at that, not yet a turning, but the first grain of one. I am accused, further, by a letter 5 years old, of infidelity with a man in Bristol who does not exist. I have here a signed statement from the Bristol solicitor's clerk instructed, 18 months ago, to invent such a woman, and instructed by whom. She set the letter on the table before the magistrate, the same way she had once set a ring down before 40 witnesses, both hands, unhurried. The instruction is in Mr. Reginald Ashcombe's own hand. I would ask that it be compared, before this assembly, to the letter my husband read aloud in his own hall 8 years ago, which I have also kept. The magistrate compared them. It did not take long. The hand was, to anyone in the room with eyes, unmistakably the same. Reginald rose, still composed, still pleasant, and began an explanation about a family's protective instincts that had perhaps run further than good judgment allowed, and it was Sam Coulter, uninvited, unbidden, rising from the gallery where the tenants and tradesmen sat, because no one had thought to ask them to attend, and every one of them had come anyway, who cut through the explanation with the flat, unhurried patience of a man who had watched 3 landlords fail a drainage problem before a 4th one fixed it. I've farmed Thornfield land 11 years under 3 different owners, Sam Coulter said, and I'll tell this room plainly what none of you gentry seem to have troubled to ask a tenant in 8 years. That woman rebuilt an estate you'd all written off, paid every wage she owed on the day it was owed, and never once, in all that time, gave a sole reason to doubt her word on anything smaller than a shilling, let alone a thing this large. Abel Kirby stood next, and then the midwife, and then, to the particular discomfort of everyone in the room, who had spent 8 years enjoying a story, with a villain safely far away in Bristol, 4 tenant families who had never expected to be asked to speak before a county assembly, and had come anyway, because Margaret had asked them plainly, and they had, every one of them, chosen to answer. Something behind Reginald Ashcombe's composure, went out somewhere in the middle of Sam Coulter's testimony. A small visible collapse, like a house losing its fire in a single draught, and by the time the magistrate called the room to order to render its finding, he had stopped defending himself altogether, and sat instead with the particular stillness of a man who understands, all at once and completely, that every document he ever trusted to protect him has just been turned, one by one, into a rope. The finding took less than an hour. Henry Fenwick's legitimacy was affirmed without qualification, the parish register upheld, and Reginald Ashcombe's conduct referred, with the Assembly's formal censure attached, to the family's own discretion for further remedy. The room's polite way of saying that whatever happened to him next was Julian's to decide, not the law's. It was Margaret, not Julian, who decided it, standing before the Assembly with her son's hand still in hers. "I could ask this room to ruin you," she said to Reginald, quietly enough that the whole hall had to lean in to hear it, which was, she had learned over 7 years, always more effective than shouting. "I have the paper to do it, and I suspect a good many people here would consider it no less than you deserve. I am not going to. You will leave Wexmoor within the month. You will sign over whatever claim you have ever pressed against Thornfield's mortgage. And you will not, for the rest of your natural life, come within 40 miles of my son. That is mercy, Mr. Ashcombe, and I would ask you to notice that it costs me a great deal more to grant it than it would cost me to withhold it." "All right," Reginald said, very quietly, the fire entirely out of him now. "All right, then," Margaret said, and that was the whole of it. The hall began, in the minutes after, to do the thing halls do after a reckoning, a low swell of talk, chairs scraping, Lady Henshaw already composing, Margaret did not doubt, an entirely new account of her own long-standing admiration for the Duchess of Rendale's remarkable fortitude. Julian did not join the talk. He stood where he had stood throughout, very still, and when Margaret finally looked at him directly for the first time since she had entered the hall, she found a man who had watched, in real time, the full weight of what his silence 8 years before had nearly cost, and had not looked away from any of it. "I owe you an accounting," he said, when the hall had thinned enough to permit a private word. "Not an apology. You told me once those are different countries, and I understand now that you were right. I want to give you both, if you'll allow it, and I would rather do it somewhere your son isn't required to hear a man explain why he failed him. He's heard worse today, and stood through it," Margaret said. "But you may have your accounting at Thornfield, on my terms, in my study, at a time I set. That is the only invitation I am prepared to extend today. That is more than I came expecting," Julian said. "It is considerably less than you will need," Margaret said, "if you mean to stay." He came to Thornfield 11 days later, at the hour she had named, and sat across the desk where she had once totalled a drowned meadow's losses down to the shilling, and gave her finally the full accounting she had been owed since the night he read half a letter aloud in his own hall. He told her about the mother who left when he was 9, and never explained why, about the father who taught him that a woman's silence was itself a verdict, about the particular fear, he named it plainly, because she had told him once that a coward dresses fear as principle, and she would not accept the dressing again, that had made him choose his mother's counsel over his wife's presence on the single night it mattered most. "That is the explanation," Margaret said, when he had finished. "I asked for that, and I have it now, and I believe it, because it costs you something to say it, and men do not generally pay a price for lies they could tell for free. Now say the apology. It is a shorter sentence than the explanation, and a harder one, and you have not yet said it." Julian was quiet a moment, started to speak, stopped, started again, the particular broken rhythm of a man saying a true thing for the first time in his life, rather than a rehearsed one. "I am sorry," he said, "not for doubting the letter. Any fool can be handed a forgery. I am sorry that I did not ask you first. I am sorry that I let 8 years pass, believing my silence was restraint rather than what it actually was, which was cowardice with excellent manners. I am sorry for every day my son grew up not knowing my face, and I understand that sorry does not return a single one of those days to either of you." "No," Margaret said, "it doesn't. But it's the correct sentence, finally, and I'll take it as the down payment it is." She drew a fresh sheet of paper toward her, the last document of the account, though neither of them named it that yet, and set out, in the plain itemized hand she had used for 8 years of ledgers, the terms on which she would consider anything beyond an accounting. Thornfield remained hers, in her name, regardless of whatever else was decided between them. Henry's inheritance would be secured by settlement independent of any future reconciliation, so that no future Reginald could ever again make the boy's legitimacy a weapon. Her authority over her own work, the wool, the tenants, the wages she had fought to keep fair, would not be absorbed into Rendale's accounts as though it had never been separately built. And Lady Constance, whose counsel had done as much damage as Reginald's forgeries, was a reckoning Margaret would not mediate. Whatever accounting passed between mother and son was theirs to settle, not hers to arrange. "All right," Julian said, reading it through twice, the way she had once told him to finish a sentence rather than half read it. "All right, then," Margaret said, and signed her own copy, and did not, this time, need to say anything further for either of them to understand that the treaty, such as it was, had been struck. Lady Constance came to Thornfield of her own accord 3 weeks later, unannounced, and stood in the front hall with her hands folded in a way Margaret recognised, having spent 8 years learning to read the particular language of hands held very still by people unused to needing forgiveness. "I taught him to fear silence more than he feared cruelty," she said, without preamble, "and I have had 8 years to consider what that cost your son, and I find I have run out of ways to excuse it to myself. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking whether I may know my grandson at all, on whatever terms you find bearable." "On my terms," Margaret said. "Slowly, without doctrine. You may begin by asking him what he likes, rather than telling him what a Rendale ought to be. It was, of everything said in that long autumn of reckonings, the apology that cost the least in words and did the most in the itemizing. And Margaret allowed it, because mercy from power, she had learned, was worth more exactly in proportion to how easily it could have been withheld. What followed was not a single grand reconciliation, but a slow accumulation of ordinary days, each one small enough to mean nothing alone and everything taken together. The way Margaret had once told Mrs. Holloway a single fair wage meant nothing and 40 of them, paid on time for 8 years, meant an entire changed life. Julian came to Thornfield every fortnight, not to manage it. She made that condition plain the first week, and he did not test it again, but to sit in the study while she worked, the way he once had at Rendale, except that now he asked questions instead of only watching, and answered hers in turn, and the chair he sat in migrated, over several months, from the far side of the room to a spot beside her desk that neither of them ever formally decided on, only arrived at, the way water finds its level without needing to be told. He learned Henry slowly, the way a man learns a language late in life, awkward at first and then, gradually, less so, asking him about the sheep before asking him about his lessons, because Henry, it turned out, cared a great deal more about the sheep, and a father who noticed that was a father worth trusting a little further. He brought the ring back one afternoon in the second spring, not for Margaret, but for Henry, who wore it on a cord around his neck, the way his mother had once worn nothing at all, where a ring should have been, and the two facts sat together in the household's memory the way facts sit in a ledger, side by side, dated, both true. There was one relapse, and Margaret named it the moment it happened, because that was, by then, simply how the household operated. Julian, faced with a tenant dispute at Rendale, that echoed, in shape, the drainage problem Margaret had solved years before, made the decision himself, the old way, without consulting her, and only told her of it afterward, pleased with the outcome, entirely unaware he had done anything wrong until she set down her pen and looked at him with the particular stillness he had learned, by then, to recognise as a verdict forming. "You solved it well," she said. "You also solved it alone, the way you have solved everything alone for your whole life. And you did not think to ask whether I might have wanted to be part of a decision that touches land I built half my expertise learning to manage. That is the old habit. I am not angry. I am naming it, because naming it is the only thing that keeps it from becoming the pattern again." Julian was quiet a long moment. "You're right," he said, finally, without the excuse she had half expected and did not receive. "I'll bring the next one to you before I decide it, not after." He did. It became, over the following year, simply how decisions were made between them, brought, discussed, settled together, and the not doing of the old habit mattered, Margaret found, considerably more than any single grand gesture could have. Because roofs are proven in weather, not in speeches, and Julian had finally understood the difference between the two. It was on an ordinary evening in Henry's 8th year, no anniversary, no assembly, nothing marked on any ledger, that Julian said the thing Margaret had been waiting 8 years to hear, stated plainly rather than implied. "I would choose you," he said, "not because I owe you a debt I'm still repaying, though I am, and will be for some time yet. I would choose you if there were no debt at all, if none of it had ever happened, if I met you tomorrow for the first time with no history between us. I have been choosing you, in fact, for some time now, every fortnight, every ledger, every ordinary Tuesday I have driven 40 miles to sit in a chair beside yours. I only hadn't said it in those words until tonight." "That," Margaret said, "is the first sentence you have ever said to me that I did not need to check against a ledger. Is that a yes?" "It is a beginning," she said, which I've found is a more honest word than yes. They did not marry again, having never been unmarried, but Julian moved his household south within the year, formally merging Rendale's northern acreage under a single set of accounts kept, from that point forward, in Margaret's hand as often as his own, and Thornfield's name was struck into the deed beside Rendale's rather than absorbed beneath it, because that had been. From the first itemised page of her terms, a condition she had not been willing to bend. 2 years later, the house at Thornfield had grown a second wing, not for grandeur but for the school Margaret founded there for tenant children of both estates, taught 3 mornings a week by a schoolmistress paid the same fair wage Margaret had insisted on for every worker under her care since the drainage was first dug, a practice that had by then spread quietly to every farm in the county whose landlord had watched Thornfield's fortunes and drawn the obvious conclusion. Sam Coulter's eldest daughter was among the first pupils to letter her own name. Abel Kirby's contract with Thornfield Wool was by then the oldest and most trusted on his books. Reginald Ashcombe was last reported keeping a modest set of rooms in a town 2 counties distant, unmarried, unvisited, a man whose paper had finally run out of places to hide. Henry, 10 years old, wore the ring openly now, no longer around his neck on a cord, but set aside for the day. Everyone understood without needing to say it, when he would give it to a wife of his own, not as a symbol of what a Rendale bride must prove, the way his grandfather had once demanded, but as a token, his mother had told him plainly, of the difference between an obligation kept and a choice renewed, which was, she said, the only inheritance in that family actually worth passing on. Rendale Hall, in the second winter after Julian moved south, was let mostly quiet, its northern rooms shuttered for economy, its heart of the household relocated to a house that had once let in more weather than it kept out, and now, by every account of everyone who visited it, felt like the only room in the county that had ever properly learned how to breathe. Doors that opened without the old held-breath caution. A study where a duke and a duchess argued cheerfully over drainage figures, neither of them any longer needed to prove to the other. A boy asleep upstairs, who knew his father's face, as well as he knew the shape of his own name. She had stopped asking to be seen, somewhere in those 8 years, though she could not have said the precise day it happened, any more than a tide can name the hour it turns. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not through the beauty no one had ever thought to credit her with, and not through the anger she had never once permitted herself to spend, but through 8 years of paper, kept honestly, dated faithfully, and paid in full. That was not a thing that could be taken from her again, not by a forged letter, not by a frightened man's silence, not by a county's careless first verdict. It was hers, entered in her own hand, closed and balanced, and it would remain so long after every voice that had once called her unsuitable had been forgotten by the very ledgers they had tried, and failed, to write her out of.